The sun was already high when I first saw her, the heat drawing a shimmer off the dust between us. A ragged scrap of canvas flapped in the wind, its edges tearing free from the stakes. She lay half in shadow, half in the glare, unmoving, except for the faint tremor of one hand. The road behind me was empty, the nearest water a mile off. My pack was heavy with oak planks and scrap iron, but I set it down anyway. I wasn't looking for anyone that day yet. Here she was, left to the wind and the flies. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're listening from in the comments and tap like and subscribe if you've ever been in a place where one choice could change the rest of your life. My name's Jed Hartley. I've worked wood since I was big enough to hold a saw, growing up in a family that believed a day's labor was a man's measure. My father built barns and wagons. My mother mended clothes until the seams gave up for good. We had little more than a pair of good horses and a patch of earth that fought us for every stalk of corn, but we were taught never to turn away a neighbor in need. Sundays were for the small whitewashed church at the far end of the valley, where the preacher spoke as much about honest work as he did about scripture. I left home at 24 after a fire took my brother and left the old barn in ashes. Since then, I've lived on the edge of town in a one-room shop I built myself, making yokes, wheel spokes, and coffins when they were called for. The railroad money never touched me. I kept to my tools, my stove, and the quiet. Folks in town said I was odd, but they came when a wagon tongue split or a door frame sagged. My life was plain frugal and predictable until the morning I found her. Out here, survival favors the strong or the well-connected. She was neither. Her face was pale under the sunburned lips, cracked hair tangled with dust. The sack of oats beside her was tied too tight for her weak fingers to open the water jug tipped in the dirt. Whoever left her had meant for the desert to finish the job. I'd seen hardship before, but there was something in the way she kept her eyes open against the wind that made me stop. I stood there longer than I meant to, weighing what could come of it. A man with sense might have walked on. Work waited for me back at the shop, and the day was slipping toward evening. But sense has never been the whole of what guides a man. I took a step closer, and her gaze fixed on mine, sharp despite the strain. My boots stirred the dust as I knelt beside her, the air between us holding that question. Neither of us spoke. That was the moment I knew the day would not end the way it began. By the time I eased Miriam through the shop doorway that first day, the light was thinning to gold, and the dust hung low in the air. I set her down on the cot, tucked against the far wall, the same one I used when winter nights pressed too cold to keep working. The boards creaked under my boots as I crossed to the workbench for the jar of beans I'd carried in from the trail. She tried to reach for it, her fingers trembling, but couldn't manage more than brushing the rim. I opened it, set the spoon in her hand, and stepped back to let her eat in her own time. The place was quiet except for the faint scrape of her spoon and the soft ticking of the tin roof cooling. I picked up a wagon yoke I'd been shaping the week before, sanding it smooth, while keeping my ear tuned to the small sounds from the cot. When her cup tipped later, I crossed the room, righted it, and wiped away the spill without saying a word. Her eyes followed me, but she didn't speak. Before turning in, I unfolded a second blanket and laid it across her legs. She didn't thank me, and I didn't expect her to. Morning came cool, the kind that carries a trace of damp in the air. I'd fallen asleep in the chair by the bench, my boots still on. The lamp burned down to its last breath of oil. Miriam was awake before I stirred, sitting as upright as her strength allowed, fingers clutching the edge of the blanket. She looked toward me but kept silent as I rose, stretched the ache out of my shoulders, and moved to the stove. The skillet hissed when I poured in the cornmeal batter. The smell of toasting bread filled the room. She answered when I asked about the fire, her voice rasping from disuse, and ate slowly when I set the plate near her. Her eyes moved over the room as though marking its limits, the low shelves lined with jars of nails, the narrow table under the single window, the battered door that leaned a little on its hinges. I'd built it for one, but she was here now. Without asking about her past, I pulled a plain brown dress from the cabinet mended in several places and placed it near her feet. She studied it, then looked at the old garment she wore torn and dust-stained. I fetched a basin of well water, a bar of pine-scented soap, and set them beside her, without comment, then turned my back so she could wash. By midday, I'd brought over a small pile of leather scraps and 2 spools of thread, asking if her hands could still work a stitch. She nodded and set to it with slow, careful passes of the needle. I returned to my bench, the sound of her work blending with the steady rasp of my file. By evening, she had finished half a grip, the lines uneven, but sound. I set a wooden box by her cot before bed filled with more scraps and left it at that. The third morning came with a haze over the window. I'd been outside before sunup, tending to a few things in the yard. When I came back in, she was awake, the box of leather beside her. Her arms were sore from the sewing, but she didn't complain. I set a small wheel of cheese, 2 eggs, and a square of bread on the table, cooking them, as I always did, without waste or fuss. She watched the skillet like the smell alone could hold her upright. While we ate, she asked if I'd always lived alone. I told her, not always, then spoke of my brother and the barn fire that took him. She listened without interruption. When I asked about her, she told me her family decided she slowed them down, that they couldn't feed someone who couldn't work. We left it there. That afternoon, I cleared a space by the window and padded a wooden crate so she could sit upright in the sunlight. Her breath caught as she settled into place, eyes fixed on the view outside the scattered timber. The broken rims stacked by the shed, the bee drifting past the glass. I handed her a block of pine and a strip of sandpaper. Her strokes were hesitant at first, then steadier. By dusk, she had smoothed 2 pieces, lining them up side by side, as though to measure what she'd done. I glanced down and told her it was good work. That night, as I banked the stove, I saw the change in her shoulders. The dullness she'd carried in from the tent was lifting, replaced by something more solid. She wasn't just lying still anymore. She was beginning to take root here, even if she didn't say so. The next day settled into a rhythm. I worked the bench or the yard. She stitched leather grips, sorted nails, or sanded wood. When she tired, she rested without apology. I noticed her eyes followed the light as it moved across the floor, the way she measured her reach against the shelves. Her hands grew surer with the tools I passed her, and her voice no longer caught when she asked questions. One afternoon, I brought in a wooden frame with carved wheel mounts, leather straps, and a cutout seat. She looked at it, then at me, and asked if I was building her a chair. I told her I figured it was time. She asked why, and I said because she needed to move because I had the parts. She stared for a moment, then told me she'd help finish it. We worked on it in the evenings. She stitched padding for the armrests while I shaped the footrest and fitted the wheels. The sound of the tools was steady, the space between us easy. She didn't speak of what might come next, and I didn't press. When the chair was nearly done, I told her we'd try it out back first, just the 2 of us. She nodded, her eyes fixed on the wheels. That night, the shop felt different, not louder, not fuller, but carrying a weight that hadn't been there before. I knew the next day would bring a change neither of us could turn back from. The morning the chair was ready, I slid the frame across the floor until it rested beside her cot. The leather seat was stitched, the armrests smoothed, and the footrest wide enough to keep both legs steady. She stared at it, her breath shallow, then looked at me. I told her we'd take it slow. Sliding one arm behind her back and the other under her thighs, I lifted her from the cot, letting her guide with her arms. She winced once when her hips shifted, but held her grip on my shoulder until I eased her into place. She sat still for a few moments, her hands on the armrests, her feet resting lightly on the wood. I told her it wouldn't hurt, and she nodded. When she looked around from that height, her eyes paused on the shelves, then the stove, then the doorway. I said we'd try it out back when she was ready. The ramp I'd built sloped to the packed dirt yard with a clear stretch between the shed and the fence. The ground was uneven in places, but solid. I stepped back and told her to give it a try. She placed her palms on the rims, pushed slowly, the chair rolling forward a few feet. She tried again, turned slightly, then straightened. A faint laugh broke from her before she could stop it. I cleared a few stones from her path, showing her how to angle over shallow ruts. She practiced turns, starts, and stops until her arms began to shake. That night, for the first time, she sat at the table with me. I ladled stew into 2 bowls, setting one in front of her. She ate slower than I did, but steady, keeping the spoon upright. Halfway through, she said her father used to carry her to the table when she was small enough, until the day he told her she should eat alone. She didn't say more, and I didn't press. After I washed the bowls, she told me she wanted to learn to use tools, not just sew or sand. I told her I'd teach her when she was ready. She asked again why I was doing all this for her, and I answered the same as before, because I wanted her here. She didn't speak after that, but the air between us felt settled. The next morning, she was already working the chair in tight turns across the room. I set the saw on the bench and showed her how to mark a board with charcoal before cutting. Her grip was awkward at first, the saw drifting from the line, but after a few tries, the teeth bit clean. She cut 3 slats that fit the crate frame without trimming. Her palms reddened, so I told her we'd make gloves from scrap hide. She smirked and said she'd earned them. By evening, she'd washed her hands and was sitting with me on the porch. We watched dust drift down from the hills, a hawk circling overhead. She said sometimes she dreamed her family might come back, not to apologize, but to take her again. I told her they wouldn't, and if they did, they wouldn't get near her. She didn't doubt me. When the light faded to blue, she asked why I hadn't gone into town lately. I told her I didn't want to leave her alone again. She said she could handle herself. I knew that, but told her I still didn't trust most folks. She asked if that was about my brother, and I said partly. The roof of the barn had been cracked. The town knew it, and when it gave way, he was still inside. She only said she was sorry. We sat quiet after that, until she reached across and set her hand on my knee. I looked at it then, at her. She said she wasn't going anywhere. I nodded. A little later, I leaned in and kissed her slower than the first time. She didn't hesitate. When we drew back, she said she thought men like me didn't exist. I told her I thought the same about women like her. That night, I laid a mattress by the stove low to the floor beside her cot. I didn't say why. She wheeled closer, placed her hand over mine, and said she wanted to stay close not for safety, but for herself. I helped her settle slow and careful. When she rested her head against my shoulder, I set my cheek against her hair. The fire burned low. The wind pressed at the boards, and for the first time since I'd found her in the dust, there was no distance left between us. 3 weeks had passed since I asked Miriam to marry me. The mornings carried a cooler edge, now the kind that told you autumn wasn't far off. The scrub trees behind the shed had begun to show yellow along their curled leaves. Miriam moved around the shop with a sureness that made the chair seem like an extension of her. She stitched grips for wagon tools, sorted lengths of lumber by size, and swept the floor each night with a wide broom strapped to the front of her chair, a trick she'd worked out herself. I didn't often say so aloud, but I saw the thought she put into every task. The cot had been folded and stored in the loft. Her place was beside me now, whether we worked at the bench or sat by the stove in the evenings. We hadn't made an announcement to the town, but between ourselves, the matter was settled. I was husband, she was wife. It was a quiet thing, the sort you didn't need to prove with ceremony. That morning, I was set to ride into town for supplies. I hadn't gone alone since bringing her home. but she insisted she was fine for a few hours. She had a list written in her careful, steadying hand. Flour metal dowels, lamp oil. I added thread and soap. She asked if I thought she was saying I smelled, and I told her it was the stove that needed it. She smiled without looking up from her work. Before leaving, I asked again if she'd be all right. She said she had tools and a hammer. I saddled the horse, and she called after me not to let the merchant overcharge. The road was still damp in places from last week's rain, but most of it kicked up dust under the hooves. I kept my pace steady, knowing she'd be counting the hours. The shop was quiet when I returned the yard, the same as I'd left it. But before I even reached the door, she wheeled out to meet me. There'd been a knock while I was gone, she said, a man's voice asking for me, saying he'd heard I had a woman here who didn't belong. He'd claimed her folks were in town and that she couldn't live out here alone. She'd told him she wasn't alone, and when he pushed, she'd listed the work she'd done in the shop. He'd left before long. I asked if she was all right. She said she'd handled it fine, didn't even need the hammer. I stepped down from the saddle, took her hand, and told her she wasn't going anywhere. She answered she hadn't planned to. That night, while the stove burned low, I opened one of the parcels I'd brought back. Inside was a thin silver band. I told her it wasn't much, but it was hers. She said she didn't need proof, but I said I did, sliding it onto her finger. It fit. Her hand trembled slightly as she brought it to her chest. I told her I wanted to start building something new. She asked what, and I said a room out back with bigger windows and more light. She asked what it was for, and I told her for our child. Her eyes lifted to mine, but she didn't speak right away. I said she didn't need to tell me. I already knew. A laugh caught her off guard, and she covered her mouth. We didn't speak much after that. The stove crackled, and the wind pressed against the walls. The season outside was shifting, but inside everything felt steady. She rested her head on my shoulder. I told her she hadn't ended up here, she'd earned it. She didn't answer, but I felt her weight settle against me in a way that told me she understood. The fire burned down to embers before either of us moved. Tomorrow I'd start measuring the back wall for the frame of the new room. But that night the work could wait. The days that followed settled into a pace that made the weeks before seem distant. Mornings began with the smell of coffee drifting from the stove and the sound of Miriam moving her chair across the shop floor. She worked without needing to be told. Taking up whatever task I set out, sewing leather grips, sanding small blocks for tool handles, or sorting the nails into jars by size. Her hands had grown steadier, her movements more certain. By midday, she'd roll out to the backyard, stopping to rest near the shed where the sunlight was warm, but not harsh. I'd bring her a tin cup of water, and she'd set it on the small crate beside her before taking up the sandpaper again. We didn't talk much while we worked, but it wasn't an uneasy quiet. It left room for the scrape of wood under her hands, the ring of my hammer, and the rustle of wind through the dry grass. One afternoon, I noticed she kept glancing toward the slope that rose behind the shed. It wasn't steep, but the ground was loose with gravel, and patches of grass gone dry from the summer heat. I asked her what she was thinking, and she said she wanted to see if she could reach the top. I studied the hill a moment, then asked if she was sure. She said she was. The next morning, I packed a canteen, tied it to the back of her chair, and we set out. She paced herself from the start, pushing steady breathing deep. The wheels caught on stones more than once, but she adjusted each time, working the rims without asking for a hand. I walked beside her close enough in case she tipped, but she never did. 20 minutes later, she reached the top. From up there, the land opened wide brown hills fading into a low blue horizon, a thin ribbon of creek glinting far off. She sat still, catching her breath, the sweat along her neck catching the sun. She said she hadn't thought she could do it. I told her I had. She turned toward me at that, but didn't speak. We stayed until the breeze cooled the back of our necks, then started down slow. Back at the shop, she went straight to sorting the day's work, pulling an old rocking chair frame toward her and checking the joints. I set about cutting pegs to fit, watching her more often than I meant to. The next day passed much the same, her in the chair by the window, with a length of leather, me at the bench. It was late afternoon when the quiet broke. A knock sounded at the door, sharp and quick. I was in town fetching a shipment of lumber, so she answered it alone. Later, she told me the man asked after me, saying he'd heard about her, saying she didn't belong here. He'd claimed her family was nearby, that she wasn't fit to live this far out. She told him she'd been on this land longer than he had, and that she'd built and mended more here than he'd ever know. He left without pressing further. When I returned, she met me outside before I'd even tied off the horse. She told me what happened, ending with, "I handled it." I asked if she was all right. She nodded and said she didn't even need the hammer. I stepped down, took her hand, and told her she wasn't going anywhere. She said she hadn't planned to. That evening, while the fire settled low, I brought out the silver band I'd kept wrapped in cloth. I told her it wasn't much, but it was hers. She said she didn't need it, but I slid it onto her finger anyway. It fit. Her hand trembled slightly before she set it against her chest. I told her I wanted to build a room out back, bigger windows, more light. She asked what it was for, and I told her for our child. She didn't speak at once, just met my eyes. I said she didn't have to tell me. I already knew. She laughed soft and surprised, covering her mouth. The wind had picked up outside, rattling the boards, but in the shop it was steady and warm. She leaned against my shoulder, and we sat that way until the fire sank to embers. Tomorrow I'd begin measuring for the frame, but for now, there was no hurry. By the first week of October, the mornings had taken on that thin chill that made you reach for an extra layer before stepping outside. I'd started stacking kindling in the shed, knowing the first frost wasn't far off. Miriam had a pattern to her days now. Mornings at the workbench beside me, afternoons in the yard, or by the window where the light was strongest. The chair moved with her like it was part of her own frame, and she'd learned to angle over the shallow ruts in the yard without slowing. One morning, after she'd finished stitching the grip on a short-handled mallet, she asked how much longer before I began on the new room. I told her I'd set the first posts before the month was out. She nodded and rolled over to the back door, pausing to look at the stretch of ground where it would stand. "Feels like it belongs there," she said. I agreed. That afternoon, I saddled the horse for a trip into town. We needed more flower nails and a couple of hinges for the storage chest she'd been repairing. I told her I'd be back before sundown, but her eyes followed me to the gate like she was measuring the hours in her head. By the time I returned, the air was sharper, carrying the scent of wood smoke from somewhere beyond the ridge. I found her sorting strips of leather on the table. She'd already cut and punched holes in two, laying them aside in neat rows. She asked if I'd had trouble in town. I told her no, and she didn't mention the man who had come by before, though I knew it was still in the back of her mind. We spent the next 2 days working side by side. I planed the edge of a wide plank while she sanded down the back slats for a chair repair. Late on the third afternoon, she set her tools aside and said she wanted to try the hill again this time, without stopping at the halfway point. The light was already tilting toward evening, but I said we could make it. The climb was slower than before. The ground had softened in spots from a night's rain, and the wheels left faint tracks behind her. She pushed, steady breathing through the strain, her gloves creaking against the rims. I walked close but didn't touch the chair. When we reached the top, she turned it toward the wide view without waiting for me to speak. The wind was cool up there, carrying the smell of dry grass and the faint tang of the creek far below. We stayed until the shadow of the shed reached the fence line. On the way back, she asked if I'd ever considered leaving this place behind altogether. I told her no, that it was the one thing I'd built that hadn't left me. She didn't answer, but I caught her glancing toward the shop as we came down the slope. That night, after we'd eaten, I noticed her working the buckles on her gloves longer than usual. When I asked if something was wrong, she shook her head. "Just thinking about tomorrow," she said. I knew she meant the posts for the new room. The next morning, I laid out the tools and measured the ground along the back wall. She wheeled over, watching as I marked the spots for the corner stakes. "Want me to hold them steady?" she asked. I handed her one and she braced it in place, while I drove it in with the mallet she had finished earlier in the week. We worked like that until the last stake was set. She rolled back to see the rough outline of the room, her eyes following the shape from one corner to the next. "It's real now," she said. I nodded, wiping the sweat from my brow with the back of my hand. By late afternoon, the wind had shifted. A bank of clouds pushed in from the west, dimming the light sooner than usual. I was stacking the last of the tools when I heard hoofbeats on the road. They slowed near the gate, then stopped. Miriam had turned her chair toward the sound before I even looked up. A rider sat there, coat collar turned high, hat brim shadowing his face. He dismounted without a word, looping the reins over the fence post. I stepped toward the gate, feeling the weight of his stare before he spoke. "Looking for Jed Hartley," he said. "I've got something that belongs to him." His hand dipped into the saddlebag, drawing out a folded envelope sealed with a strip of wax. He held it out, but didn't cross the fence. Behind me, I heard Miriam shift in her chair, the leather creaking under her hands. I took the envelope, the paper thick and cool in my grip. The rider tipped his hat once mounted up and turned back down the road without another word. I stood there a moment longer, the seal unbroken, the air gone still around us. I turned the envelope over in my hands, the wax seal still unbroken. Miriam had rolled closer, her eyes fixed on it, but she didn't speak. I set it on the table, poured 2 mugs of coffee, and slid one toward her. She nodded once, then kept her gaze on the envelope like she could read its weight. When I broke the seal, the paper inside was thick and folded tight. The handwriting was clean, each letter set down with a deliberate hand. It was from a man named Elias Carter, claiming to be Miriam's uncle. He wrote that word of her survival had reached him in Cedar Bluff, and that certain members of her kin meant to come for her, not out of care, but to claim rights to land left in her name. She read over my arm, her face still. The letter gave dates when they planned to arrive where they'd be staying, and it warned of a man traveling with them, not of blood, but bound by debt. Elias said he would ride here ahead of them if he could, but the tone carried no promise. I refolded the letter and set it on the table. "How much of that's true?" I asked. Miriam leaned back, her hands resting on the worn arms of her chair. "The land's real enough. My father left it when he died. I thought they'd sold it off years ago." She let out a slow breath. "If they want it, they won't care what happens to me." We talked long into the evening. I asked if she wanted to leave before they arrived, but she shook her head. "Running only teaches them I can be moved," she said quietly. I could hear the wind working at the shutters, the long pause between its sighs. The next morning, I walked into town to speak with Sheriff Doolin. He listened without cutting me off, then asked to see the letter. After reading it twice, he folded it neat and handed it back. "You keep this close," he said. "I'll keep watch, but you best be ready to stand your ground." His eyes were steady, but I could tell he'd already weighed the trouble coming. On the way back, I stopped at the Mercantile for extra lamp oil and a small lockbox. By midday, I'd stored the letter inside and placed it in the cabinet beneath my workbench. Miriam spent the afternoon mending a leather strap for the water bucket, saying little, though I caught her glancing at the road more than once. 2 days later, the sound of wagon wheels reached us just past noon. Miriam had been by the window and saw the dust plume first. She wheeled back to the table, her movements measured. I stepped outside, leaning on the rail as the wagon slowed near the gate. 3 figures sat on the bench, 2 men and a woman. The older man in front wore a dark coat despite the warmth the brim of his hat pulled low. The woman, sharp-faced with pale eyes, looked me over before speaking. "We're here for Miriam Dane," she said. "Family business." I told them she was safe where she was and that any business could be discussed with her consent. The younger man shifted in his seat, his hand resting on his thigh like he was used to reaching for something hidden there. The older man's gaze slid toward the house. "We can talk inside," he said. I shook my head. "We'll talk here." I felt Miriam's presence just behind me, the faint creak of her chair as she stopped in the doorway. She spoke before I could. "If you've come for the land, say so plain. You've no other claim on me." The woman's mouth tightened. "You don't know what's best for you," she said. Miriam's voice stayed even. "I know enough to decide where I live." The younger man shifted again, his boots scraping the wagon floor. I caught the sheriff's horse in the corner of my eye, Doolin riding up from the south road. He reined in just short of the gate, tipping his hat to no one in particular. "Afternoon," he said. "Heard there might be a conversation needing a witness." The three in the wagon stiffened, but no one spoke first. Doolin glanced at me, then at Miriam, and waited. The older man finally cleared his throat. "We'll return in 2 days," he said. "Consider what's at stake." He flicked the reins and the wagon rolled forward, the wheels grinding over the packed dirt. Miriam watched them go without a word. When the dust settled, Doolin dismounted and came to the porch. "They'll be back," he said. "But so will I." He tipped his hat again, mounted up, and rode toward town. That night, I set the extra lamp oil by the door and checked the hinges on the shutters. Miriam sat at the table, her gloves off, running her fingers over the grain of the wood. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying the promise of colder nights. We didn't speak much, but we didn't need to. 2 days passed without sight of the wagon. The wind carried the smell of rain, and the clouds stacked low over the hills. Miriam sat near the window, her hands folded in her lap, watching the road, as if it might answer her. By mid-afternoon, the sound of hooves broke the quiet. Sheriff Doolin rode in with another man at his side, older, weathered, wearing a trail coat stained with dust. He introduced himself as Elias Carter, Miriam's uncle, the one who'd sent the letter. His voice was steady, though I could see the relief in his eyes when he looked at her. Elias told us he'd met the others on the road and sent them back the way they'd come, with clear warning to stay gone. He had the land deed in his satchel signed over to Miriam, free and clear. No more claimants, no more threats. Miriam reached for it with careful hands, the paper crisp under her fingers. She didn't say much, just a quiet thank you that carried more weight than any long speech. Elias nodded as though words would only get in the way. We saw him off before the light failed. The sheriff stayed a little longer, sipping coffee at the table, telling us he'd keep watch for a few more days just in case. When he left, the house felt still, in a way it hadn't for weeks. That night I lit the lantern and worked by its glow while Miriam sat across from me, the deed on the table between us. Outside, the rain began tapping soft against the windows, settling into a steady rhythm. She looked at me, then her voice low. "It's mine now. Not just the land, my choice. Where I stay, who I see, all of it." I nodded, knowing nothing more needed saying. We sat like that until the fire burned low, the kind of quiet that feels like a home being made. The storm moved on by morning, leaving the air sharp and clean. The road outside was empty again, just the sound of the wind in the grass. If there's a lesson in it, maybe it's this: sometimes justice doesn't arrive with noise and shouting. Sometimes it comes in the steady hands of those who choose to stand with you, no matter the weather. And out here on the frontier, that's worth more than land or gold. Thank you for listening to my story. If it's left you thinking of your own, I hope you'll share it with someone who'll carry it forward.